back, I had a Commodore 64, I had an Atari 2600. That was a lot of tiny sprites on screen, barely moving around, and it was all in your imagination, and that was pretty cool. And then moving forward, sort of, as you got into the Nintendo era, I remember seeing Super Mario Brothers for the first time and just being completely blown away. It was like, wow, there's an arcade in my house. This is the coolest thing ever. And so what you saw in that generation in particular was lots of side-scrollers, right? Lots of Mario emulation kind of games, which was sort of a progression of what had been happening with better art, better sprites. But then you started to see sort of other genres starting to crop up, like the RPG really started to come into its own in the Nintendo era when you could actually have like a Final Fantasy, or you could have some of these other games that were coming out where, you know, it was a new thing. You couldn't really play those in the arcade because it would take forever. These were 40, 50, 60-hour games. And on top of that, they finally had a medium where they could get a lot of art, get a lot of stuff in there. The cartridge could handle a fair amount of stuff. And so that was interesting. And then, you know, as we moved through the Nintendo era and moved into the Sega stuff, and started to see more sports games at home, that kind of stuff. And then moving on to the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64, you started to see 3D for the first time. And that was fascinating because it started to add a whole new dimension into what gamers were used to. And so for a long time, it had been this 2D, sort of parallaxing 2D planes in a lot of different ways. And you know, the closest you got to 3D was Contra, when the two guys are running down the hallway together. As you sort of moved into that 3D era, you started to see people start to play with what are the kinds of mechanics we can do now? What are the things that we can actually play with? You know, what are these what's this new world of this other dimension? And so it was hard. You know, it's hard to give the players this whole nother level of freedom that they weren't used to, and people had to get used to it both from a development and from a player standpoint. And you start to see games, you know, you start to see more action adventure style games, I'd say. Like on the Atari, obviously you had Pitfall, which was technically an action adventure game, but it was more of a platformer. But then moving into 3D, you started to see stuff where, you know, you get Lara Croft, you get Tomb Raider, you get these other characters that are sort of moving through a 3D environment and doing all kinds of interesting acrobatics and stuff like that. And then it got more and more powerful. So you got the PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2. Now you can really do some stuff. Now you've got a lot of power. You can have GTA 3, which is a crazy open world game running on the PS2. The Xbox comes online. You've got Dreamcast. All these things are sort of moving forward, you know, pushing the boundaries forward. And then you get to the PlayStation 3, the 360, even the Wii to some extent, or the Wii U. It's less and less about what you can't do. It's more what should you do, or why should you do it. There are a lot less constraints, and in some ways that's actually more terrifying than having constraints. It's a lot easier to sit there and go like, well, we just can't do that, so let's figure out a way around it, you know, or let's make an interesting decision because we can't do something. When you're sitting there with the PlayStation 3 and a dev team like we have here at Naughty Dog, I had never worked at a place where I could ask for something and be guaranteed I was going to get it. And so every other job I had before this in the industry, I would say, this is the kind of thing I'm thinking about doing, or this is the kind of thing I want to do in this level, or this is the kind of experience I want the player to have here. And the answer more often than not was, that's not in scope. That's not in budget. That's not in, you know, that's not in the idea for this game, you know, lots of different reasons, but often technical, often that we just don't have time to do that, right? And so when I came here, one of the things that sort of at first was exciting and then became terrifying was, I want to do this thing. Okay. And then it was like, oh, wait, what? Oh, we're going to do that? Okay, awesome. And usually that would also come with, okay, we can do that. And you probably want all these other things that you probably haven't thought about yet, but I've totally already thought about before you. And you're going to need all these parameters and stuff. And here you go. It's yours. You can have it. Play with it. And that is almost overwhelmingly scary until you get used to it. You're like, okay, cool. I'm only limited sort of by my imagination now, which means, first of all, it's a lot faster to try stuff out, which is really nice. The iteration time is really, really short. And so you can mess around and make mistakes, and it's not as costly to the process. You can literally, you can do anything. And we're only limited sort of by what we, you know, wanted to do, not so much what we could do. And so going forward here, I think it's going to be more and more about that. It's going to be about, you know, what is the game you want to make, and what is the experience you want to give the player? And it's not going to be so much about like, technically, how is that going to happen? It's going to be much more thinking about what is the player experience? You know, how can we make this more streamlined? How can we get in the game the feelings we want to get and the emotions we want to get, and not so much about technical issues and technical limitations. We're really only limited right now by our imagination. I can't think of something that we couldn't do if we really wanted to. it's getting to be more and more about what are you bringing to the table as a developer. It's not so much about what any given console can do. It's about what can you do? What is your ability as a developer to interact with the player? The tools are getting easier to use. There's more and more stuff out there for young game developers to go through. And so you're starting to see a younger generation who's fearless and they just want to try stuff and they can grab Unity and sit at home and make a game. And that's amazing. And so hopefully we're on the cusp here of a massive revolution in terms of what we're going to see in terms of games. And I think you're already starting to see it. You have Naughty Dog making a AAA game, for millions of dollars, and you've got guys making a game in their basement, and they're equally valid experiences. And I think we're I think we're on the cusp of something really, really cool. And hopefully development costs will in some ways go, they're always going to go up, of course, on the higher end, but on the lower end, hopefully they'll go down. And so we'll get more and more people in the industry and we'll get more unique points of view. There's a desperate cry out there for content that people haven't seen before or for IPs that are original and interesting. And I think we'll start to see more and more of that going forward. It's sort of like the indie movie scene was, 15, 20 years ago. And I think we're getting more and more democratization of the tools, which allows that to happen. I'd say the biggest difference between a video game and any of the other sort of mediums that we're often compared to, like film or books or comics or whatever, is that it's interactive, which is obviously the most obvious answer, but I think it's an important distinction. There's things you can do in games that you can't do in any other medium. You can put a player through a literal, level of hell and make them feel what that might feel like by putting a controller in their hand or putting the ability for them to control what's happening in their hand. And so one thing we've always sort of tried to accomplish is allow as much freedom as we possibly can while still trying to get a narrative or character sense in our games. When we do well, when we succeed, we do it better in this medium than anybody else, I think. I'm not saying Naughty Dog, I think that the medium of video games itself, it has that unprecedented ability to allow the player to really feel like they're playing a movie, or they're on the other side of it, that's one end of the spectrum, is they're playing basically they're playing an awesome movie. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got something like an RPG where the player's literally dictating their entire experience. Everything is about what they're doing and they're driving the experience forward. Another thing I think is interesting, I think there's something fascinating about games in the sense that games are such a broad spectrum, far broader than a comic book or a novel or a movie. Those things are all very small boxes just because of what they are. Whereas in games, you have just this tremendous space that's associated with games. You have everything from Pac-Man, or Tetris, or puzzle games, or things that you are all about just interacting in your brain and figuring things out and puzzling, or Twitch shooters, or Facebook games, Farmville, which are essentially interactive time wasters, but they're super fun. That's not a bad thing. And that's a really cool thing that people can log on anywhere and play a game that's quick and easy, and they grow an attachment to it. I think that shows how powerful the medium actually is that, this fake farm on Facebook is more real to them than something else might be that other things might not be. And then the other thing I think is interesting about sort of the difference between games and film and books and comic books and all that stuff is that all of us in games who care about narrative are trying to approach it, I think, in various different ways, but we're trying to accomplish what movies do all the time, which is making you feel real emotions, making you cry, making you laugh, all those kinds of things. And if you're being honest about it, it's really hard to do. It's hard to do in movies too. Obviously, you don't cry at every movie, you don't laugh at every movie. But when you're trying to really hit those emotions and you do it well, it's a really different thing in games than it is in those other mediums. And I think it can be more powerful when done correctly because it does feel like you did it. You are the person on screen, or you're feeling what that person on screen is feeling. The other cool thing about games is that because they can be so broad, you can get that same experience in one single game. Assassin's Creed has this sort of very serious fiction of Ezio or Connor or any of their other characters, and you really feel like what those characters are going through, but at the same time, they have mini games, fun little sort of asides and stuff where you're getting sort of both ends of the experience at the same time, which is really cool. I mean, it's a different style of game from what we make, but that's just one example of how a studio with a very similar philosophy to ours in a lot of ways is doing something completely different, but yet, similar at the same time. So yeah, and then on the other end, you've got essentially what amounts to an interactive fiction experience, which is The Walking Dead. It's fantastic. It's an amazing game. It's incredibly well written, and it really does make you feel. And it's an interesting story that feels like it has some consequence that the player is interacting with. And I think that is just fascinating to me. I mean, it's amazing that a game that essentially is barely a game in the most typical sense was able to capture the imagination, and it's an amazing example. And then, I mean, last year was crazy. It was Journey, right? I mean, that's the most, in one sense, it's the most gamey game ever. It's nothing but gameplay. There's no, I mean, there is a narrative to it, obviously, and there is definitely a style to it. And Genova is brilliant at what he brought to that game. But in another sense, there's no real narrative other than what you bring to it. And then you've got something in between, like The Unfinished Swan, which was also an amazing game. It did have a narrative to it, and it was loose, but it definitely had something driving you forward. You know, it's the king telling the story and all that stuff. So it's such a cool medium. You know, just talking about it makes me happy. It's such a fun place to work. Going from sort of the earliest days of arcade, Pac-Man, even the original MUDs, stuff like that. I think there's always been a sort of segment of the gaming, both public population, people who play the games, and game creators who wanted to tell interesting stories. And so Zork was a fascinating story. I remember playing it as a kid and just being blown away. And, you know, this was obviously before internet and stuff, and having to talk to my friends to figure out all the puzzles. And that was a certain kind of interactive fiction. It was more akin to a choose-your-own-adventure novel in some senses than anything else. Going forward, as the hardware progressed, you started to see people really trying to push the medium in different ways. So you end up with things like the Final Fantasy series, which is a certain kind of storytelling, you know, very JRPG. It has its own tropes, it has its own elements to it, but there's a lot of really interesting storytelling there. But they were still always removed, I think, in some sense, from a really emotional experience, just because they were limited by the platform they were on, the graphics they had. And then you moved into CD-ROM games in the early 90s. It felt very weird to play those games, and they were hugely popular for a little while there, but it never felt right because it's a movie. You essentially knew the whole time you were playing a movie, and that clicking on certain buttons would play a different movie for you. Finally, with the PlayStation and the PlayStation 2, you started to see some really interesting stuff happening. You started to get avatars on screen that were more representative of people, easier to understand what they were trying to make you go through. It was easier to build a game that had a real fiction to it that was based in the real world. I mean, not that we haven't been trying to do this for years, but I think it started to feel like, especially on the PlayStation 2, it started to feel like we have enough graphics to really render interesting people. They weren't real, but they were real enough. And so you could start to believe in them more. And then you get to the PlayStation 3. And I think when we set out to work on we've been with Sony for a long time. We've only ever developed on Sony products. And Crash was sort of our first foray into the console world. And it was awesome. And it was very indicative of the time. And Crash being an icon himself was a big deal. And all that kind of stuff. And then the next gen, we moved on to Jak and Daxter, and that was a different style of game. So we sort of tried to open up more and give you a little more choice. And sort of as those games went on, we actually added more and more to them, with the vehicles and all that kind of stuff. And then when we got to the PlayStation 3, we really said, okay, this thing's going to give us enough power to really go back and revisit that idea of telling an interesting character-driven narrative in a way that we might be able to do that no one's done before. And so, when Amy and the guys sat down to make Uncharted 1, the touchstone was making a movie, or making the Saturday matinee movie that you could play. Not in the sense that you're literally going from QuickTime event to QuickTime event, but that you're playing the movie. That Nathan Drake is the action hero that you want to be, and that you can play that character. He had to be larger than life, and he had to be sort of a more modern Indiana Jones. So it was hugely important that when creating him that his character itself would come through and really shine on the screen. But it also was important that the art style and that the polygons we could render just were believable in themselves. He's a real guy. We want him to feel like a real guy. And it was important that he looked, basically like a real guy. And so one of the choices we made, I think that was the right one, was to not make him super, super realistic. So he's not a facsimile of a person. I mean, he's clearly a person, but he has his own style, and the art style of the games are very definitively not reality. And I think that was a good choice. And it separated us from the uncanny valley in a lot of ways, which was hugely important. I think we could have ended up in a really bad place if we tried to sort of mimic reality, especially in the early days of the PS3 before we really knew what we could do. Getting through that first game, I think, was really tricky. It was something that the studio had never really done before. It was a hairy time for sure, but the game came out, may not have been a crazy smash success, but the critics loved it. The fans who played it loved it. And so then with Uncharted 2, we sat down and looked at what we had done well in 1 and sort of took that to the limit in 2 and said, okay, now we have our tech, we have our guy, what's the story we can tell that's really going to blow people out of the water? And so with Uncharted 2, trying to just get even more of that narrative sense in there, trying to get the real feeling of what is it like to be this guy and travel around the world with him. The medium has grown up a lot from the early days. I think part of it is that we finally have the technology to render characters in a believable way, and Part of it is just something I think before Uncharted 2, no one had really done before. I mean, there was elements of these things that had all been around for a long time. Motion capture had been around, it wasn't a new technology. Putting human characters on screen certainly wasn't a new technology. But kind of combining it all together was, Uncharted 1, Uncharted 2 was the first time we had ever really said, okay, we want to do performance capture. So what does that mean? We want our guy, we want Nolan in the suit, but we want him reading his lines like he's on a TV show or like he's on a movie set, and we want the actors interacting with each other. We're not gonna do what was always been done before that was, or more or less always before that was, you put a guy who isn't your voice actor in a suit and you run him through 8 million moves, and then some animator goes through and cleans it up and stitches it all together and puts it all, makes it look nice, and then the voice actor would come in and talk on top of it. And the problem with that is, which while is valid, is it doesn't really lead to a real performance. What it leads to generally is something where the actor is sort of guessing at what is acting. He has no partner, right? He has nobody to read against. And so it's one of the hardest things to do as an actor, I think, is to sit there and sort of guess at what the other person was trying to do or is going to do, because they haven't even read their lines yet. And so we said, no, let's not do that. Let's put Nolan in the suit with Emily. Let's get them in the scene together. Let's get Richard McGonigal to come on set, and we're all there at the same time. And so on Uncharted 1, we weren't able to record the voice at the same time. We had scratch tracks, but we couldn't use any of it. And on Uncharted 2, we did it. We said, okay, we're going to actually record audio at the same time as recording the mocap. And so you get real performances, and you get it really does feel like you're shooting on a TV show or a movie. And we do this for long periods of time. So we'll get the actors in and we'll use them for almost 2 years or 3 years or whatever the project length is. And so they really get to know each other, and they really get to feel like they're part of a cast. And so they have their own little idiosyncrasies. And a lot of that comes through, I think, when you're doing these things, being able to interact with them week after week, month after month, you really start to get a through performance, which is awesome. It's like, and I think now this has sort of become commonplace, but when we were doing it on Uncharted 1, Uncharted 2, we were sort of the only people doing it. And I think the results speak for themselves. I mean, Uncharted 2 was an amazing game. Uncharted 1 was an amazing game. Uncharted 3 was an amazing game. I think The Last of Us, we sort of refined the process even more. It's even tighter than it was on Uncharted 3. And so, there's always going to be further to go. There's always going to be the ability to get, better performance, better interaction with the actors, better technologies. But I think we're not going to keep doing the same tricks. I think we're going to have to figure out something new. And, we don't want to make the same thing over and over again. Certainly as developers, you want to be challenged every single time. And I think going forward, it's going to be interesting to see sort of, we have our own ideas of stuff we want to do and interesting ways to take all our different franchises and stuff. And so trying to figure out exactly what that's going to be, I think is a really cool challenge. And it, keeps me up at night sometimes, but I think it's really exciting. I've always loved video games. I think what I've been attracted to about video games since forever is that it's another world. It's another form of escapism, I guess, at an intellectual level. It's similar to a book or a comic book or a movie, but it's so much more than that because I'm driving it. It's my experience. It's me as a person sort of being able to interact in a way that I never could have done in real life. First time I put in a disc and the music comes up and it's a start screen and I hit the button and I'm, what am I going to get now? I'm excited. And I sort of have tried to stay away from that sort of cynical, ironic viewpoint that I think you get working in the industry for a long time, just because you've seen a lot of stuff. And I feel like every time I put a disc in, there's always a chance there's going to be awesome. It's going to blow me away. It's going to be something I didn't expect. And even if I've heard about it, even if I know a lot about it, even if I know the guy who made it. With video games, I find that more often than not, there's the ability to surprise the person with something they really didn't expect just because of the medium and just because you are in control of it. And on one end, there's the completely authored experience, which really fascinating. And when it's done well, it's amazing. And it can make you feel stuff, I think, that other mediums, can't quite get to. And on the other end of it, where it's a purely player-driven experience, like that's something you cannot get anywhere else. You cannot be the Dragonborn in a movie. And also, my Dragonborn is not the same as yours or anybody else's, and your experience of Skyrim might be entirely different from mine. And when we talk to each other about it, we have a shared world, but they're different. They're different worlds, and they're not perceived in the same way. And there's no other medium that can do that. And on top of that, video games now bring people together, I think, in a way that's fascinating. Multiplayer is a huge thing. And I'm not just talking about shooting people, but just the ability to have a community that's online and talking to each other about something, which is a fictional world, is amazing. And you do get some of that with movies, obviously, with people talking about Star Wars and all that kind of stuff. But a conversation in the office is I was playing Halo 4 last night, and I tagged a guy and the Jeep blew up and I grabbed the flag and I was across, that's a story that happened to me that other people can relate to because they played the same game, but they didn't have that same experience. And their experience was just as cool. It was a different thing. I grabbed the plasma sword, I stabbed a guy, and then I saved my team from defeat. And those stories come out of every single play session in those games. That's fascinating. And then on the other end, people talking about an Uncharted style game where they all have different feelings about the characters. Some of them are the ones we intended and some of the ones we weren't. And people bring their own experience to it. And their run through of Uncharted might have been different from somebody else. That's what's exciting about games. And I think we've barely touched the surface of some of this stuff. I mean, we are like this is the first real connected generation. The Xbox obviously had Live and PS2 could go online and stuff. But now we're talking about a very sophisticated set of tools that allows players to interact in ways that they never could have before. And I think you're going to see more and more games, entering the space where it's going to be more about what the interaction is between the players and less about what the developer has designed. And so there's always going to be narrative-driven games, and I'm going to love those. There's always going to be authored experiences. There's always going to be that kind of stuff. But I think on the other end, you're going to see a huge opening up of like sort of I was saying about tools, democratization of tools. I think you're going to see that in games themselves. I think you'll see more things like Minecraft, where here's a set of very simple tools, and then look at what people did with it. Look at what they were able to create. Look at the experiences they're having. I think you're going to see more and more and more of that happening, and that's amazing. I think in general, this is just a really fascinating medium, and we're so young. Film is 100 years old. I can't wait to see 10 years from now. I couldn't picture where we are right now 10 years ago. So 10 years from now, it's going to be what, brainwaves and Google Glass and, who knows? It's going to be amazing. This is a fascinating time to be a developer. So I encourage anybody who's even thinking about video games to get into it, just because it's such a fascinating thing and there's so much you can do.